In 2022, a Federal Reserve survey found that nearly 40% of Americans could not cover a $400 emergency without borrowing or selling something. These were not people who had given up on money. Many of them were earning six figures. Some had retirement accounts. A few owned homes. They had done what they were supposed to do, and one small shock was still enough to crack the foundation. That number stuck with a lot of people. But here's the part that did not make the headlines. The problem was not the $400. It was that the wealth they had built was structured in a way that looked solid from the outside and was not. Most people approaching 40 are measuring themselves against the wrong thing. They track net worth. They compare savings rates. They stress over whether they have hit a benchmark a financial institution published, which makes them feel behind. What nobody explains is that two people can have the exact same number on paper and be in completely different positions, because one of them built something resilient. One of them built something that depends on nothing going wrong. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the savings are there, the investments are running, the income is stable, what is the actual difference between a financial life that holds under pressure and one that quietly falls apart? That difference has a name. It is the gap between fragile wealth and resilient wealth. That is what this video is about. And if you never learn to tell them apart, you can spend the next decade building a number that feels like security and is not. My name is Alex, and if you have ever looked at your accounts, felt like you were mostly on track, and still could not shake the feeling that something was missing from the picture, stay with this, because the architecture underneath your finances matters more than the balance on top of it. I'm going to show you what resilient wealth actually requires before 40, and the specific systems that make it durable when life does not go according to plan. Once you understand how the structure works, you stop managing a number and start building something that holds. And that starts with redefining what real wealth looks like, because the version most people are working toward is more fragile than it appears. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. Two people, same age, same city, roughly the same income for the past decade. One of them has a net worth of just over $1 million. The other has a net worth of $350,000. On paper, the first person is winning. In practice, they are one bad year away from a very uncomfortable conversation with their bank. The second person is not. That gap is not about discipline. It is not about intelligence. It is about structure. $1 million net worth sounds like safety, and it can be. But run the numbers on how that million is actually sitting, and the picture changes fast. If a significant chunk is tied up in a primary residence that carries a mortgage, consuming 40% of monthly take-home pay, if there are car payments stacked on top of that, if the credit cards carry revolving balances at 18 or 19% interest, then that $1 million is not a cushion. It is a number on a screen surrounded by obligations. One job loss, one medical event, one unexpected expense of the wrong size, and the whole thing starts to wobble. Now look at the $350,000. Automated contributions are going in every month without a decision being made. A fully funded emergency reserve sitting in a high-yield account. Housing costs locked in at 26% of gross income, chosen deliberately and held there. No high-interest debt. The structure is clean. This person does not have more money. They have more stability. And stability, when something goes wrong, is worth more than a larger number that cannot absorb the shock. This is what resilient wealth actually looks like. Not a milestone, not a net worth target crossed off a list. A structure that holds under pressure. Here is the mechanism behind it. Net worth is a snapshot. It captures one moment in time. What you own minus what you owe, right now, on this particular Tuesday. But snapshots do not tell you anything about what happens next. They do not tell you whether the number survives a layoff, or a hospital bill, or a market correction. The systems underneath the number are what determine that. And most people are so focused on growing the snapshot that they never stop to ask whether the foundation beneath it is actually solid. Think about someone like Marcus, a project manager in his late 30s, earning $94,000 a year. By any reasonable measure, Marcus is doing fine. He has been contributing to his 401k, that is, his employer-sponsored retirement account, since his late 20s. He owns a home. He has some savings, but his mortgage, property taxes, and insurance together consume 43% of his gross monthly income. He bought at the top of what the lender approved, not the top of what his actual life could comfortably absorb. Now, every financial decision he makes happens inside a room with very little air. A car repair becomes a credit card balance. A slow month at work becomes a month where the retirement contribution gets paused. The number on his net worth statement is growing slowly, but the structure underneath it is fragile. Marcus is one significant disruption away from finding out exactly how fragile. This is why housing is the highest leverage financial decision most people make before 40, not because it is the most exciting, because it is the highest fixed cost in the budget, and fixed costs do not flex when life gets difficult. Lock in total housing costs at or below 25 to 30% of gross income, and every other financial decision becomes easier to manage. There is room to save more, room to absorb a setback, room to make a deliberate choice rather than a desperate one. Exceed that threshold, and the math works against you at every turn, not because of bad habits, but because the base cost of staying in place is simply too high. Getting that one decision right does not guarantee everything else, but getting it wrong makes everything else harder in ways that compound quietly for years. Once the structure is defined, once you know what resilient wealth actually looks like, the next question is how to protect it. Because a well-built financial defense is what keeps the structure standing when pressure arrives, most people have significant gaps in theirs that they have never thought to look for. Most people think about building wealth as an offensive problem. Earn more, save more, invest more, push the number higher. And that instinct is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because before any of that compounds into something meaningful, there is a prior question that does not get asked nearly enough. How hard are you to destroy? That is not a dramatic way of framing it. It is the accurate one. A financial life is not just a savings account and a brokerage balance. It is a system. And like any system, what determines whether it survives is not how well it performs on a good day. It is how well it holds on a bad one. The defense layer, the emergency fund, the insurance, the legal documents most people never get around to, is not the exciting part of personal finance. It is the part that decides whether the exciting part gets to continue. Start with the emergency fund. The standard advice is 3 to 6 months of living expenses. That number has been repeated so many times, it has stopped meaning anything. Here's a more useful way to think about it. A 6-month reserve keeps the lights on. A 12-month reserve changes your behavior. When you have a full year of living expenses sitting in a high-yield savings account, currently paying somewhere between 3 and 3.5% or better, you make different decisions. You do not accept a bad job offer out of urgency. You do not stay in a situation that is costing you more than money because leaving feels financially impossible. You negotiate differently. You think longer term. The cash is not just a safety net. It is leverage. Now, here's the part of financial defense that almost nobody talks about until it is too late. Medical events are currently the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. Not poor investment decisions, not overspending on cars or vacations. Medical events. This is not a fringe risk reserved for people without coverage. It happens to people with insurance, with savings, with carefully built financial plans. One serious diagnosis, one accident, one extended period of inability to work, and a financial structure that took a decade to build can come apart in 18 months. Health insurance is the obvious response, but disability insurance is the one that actually protects the engine. Think about what disability insurance covers. It is not your house. It is not your investments. It is your income, the thing that funds everything else. If the income stops, the contributions stop. The mortgage gets difficult. The emergency fund starts draining. The entire forward momentum of the financial plan halts. And yet, currently, fewer than 1 in 3 working Americans has any private disability coverage in place. Most people are one extended injury or illness away from finding out exactly how load-bearing their income actually is. Consider someone like Diane, a registered nurse in her early 40s, who had spent 15 years building a genuinely solid financial position, good savings rate, no high-interest debt, a home with reasonable equity. Then a repetitive strain injury made it impossible to work her full caseload. Short-term disability through her employer covered a portion of her income for 3 months. After that, nothing. Within a year, she had drawn down most of her emergency fund and paused retirement contributions entirely. The wealth she had built did not disappear overnight. It eroded. Slowly, then faster. A disability policy paying 60% of her income would have cost her roughly $80 a month. She had never bought one because she had never seriously imagined needing it. That is how defense failures tend to work, not a catastrophic event that wipes everything out at once. A sustained pressure that the structure was never designed to absorb. Estate planning sits in the same blind spot. Currently, only about 38% of Gen X adults have any estate planning documents in place. No living will, no trust, no healthcare proxy, no named beneficiaries are updated on retirement accounts after a divorce or a remarriage. Without these, a grieving family does not just inherit loss. They inherit a legal and administrative tangle that can take years to resolve and cost tens of thousands of dollars to untangle. Money that should have passed cleanly to the people it was meant for. A complete estate plan is not paperwork for dying. It is protection for everyone who depends on what is being built right now. Defense does not grow the number, but it is what keeps the number from being taken apart by forces that have nothing to do with how smart or disciplined you were. Once that layer is in place, once the structure is genuinely hard to destroy, accelerating and automating growth stops being a gamble and starts being a plan. Here is a number that does not get talked about enough. At a 7% annual return, which is roughly the long-run average of a broad U.S. stock market index fund after inflation, the difference between saving 15% of your income and saving 25% is not a rounding error. Over 20 years, on an $85,000 salary, that 10% gap produces roughly $340,000 more in accumulated wealth. Not because of better investments, not because of better timing, because more money went in earlier and had longer to grow. The rate of return gets all the attention. The savings rate is doing most of the work. This matters especially in the decade before 40. This is the window where the contributions you make carry the most compounding time behind them. Every dollar saved at 34 has roughly 30 years to grow before a conventional retirement age. Every dollar saved at 44 has 20. That 10-year difference at 7% roughly doubles the outcome. The money you put in now is not just money, it is time. And time is the one input in the compound growth equation that you cannot buy back later. Now here is where a lot of people get tripped up. Fidelity's widely cited benchmark says you should have 4 times your income invested by age 40. For someone earning $85,000, that is $340,000 in retirement accounts by the time they hit their birthday. That number causes a significant amount of stress. And for most people approaching 40, it is a number they are not hitting. So let's be precise about what that actually means. 1 to 2 times your income invested by 40, paired with a consistent savings rate of 15 to 25% going forward, puts you on a genuinely strong trajectory. The benchmark is not irrelevant, but it measures a snapshot. What matters more is the direction and the rate. A person with $120,000 invested at 38, who is saving 20% of income every year, is in a far better position than someone who hit the benchmark at 35 and then stopped contributing consistently. The trajectory is the thing. Tax-advantaged accounts are where that trajectory accelerates. A Roth, that is, an individual retirement account where contributions are made after tax and growth is never taxed again, is one of the most powerful tools available to someone in their 30s. Currently, the annual contribution limit sits at $7,000. For higher earners who phase out of direct Roth eligibility, the backdoor Roth conversion is a legal workaround that accomplishes the same thing. Every dollar that compounds inside a Roth does so without a future tax bill attached to it. Over 30 years, the difference between a taxable account and a tax-free one on the same investments can easily reach 6 figures. The account type is not a technicality. It is a material part of the outcome. But here is the piece that makes all of this actually work. Automation. Not discipline, not motivation, automation. Take someone like Jerome, a logistics coordinator in his mid-30s, earning $71,000 a year. Jerome is not particularly obsessive about personal finance. He does not track every dollar. He set up automatic contributions to his 401k, his employer-sponsored retirement account, at 19% of his paycheck the day he got a raise 2 years ago, and he has not thought much about it since. He also set up an automatic extra $190 a month going toward his mortgage principal. That one decision, made once on a random Wednesday afternoon, will shorten his 30-year loan by just over 4 years and save him somewhere north of $87,000 in interest. Jerome did not do that. His past self did. His present self just lives with the result. That is the actual power of automation. It removes the most unreliable variable in any long-term financial plan, the human decision made in the moment, when motivation is low, when something else feels more urgent, when February is gloomy, and the gym is empty. And the last thing anyone wants to think about is their retirement contribution. The system runs whether Jerome is paying attention or not. One more thing worth reframing before moving on. The pressure to build multiple income streams has become its own kind of financial anxiety. Side hustles, passive income portfolios, creator businesses. The implication is that a salary is somehow not enough, that real financial security requires building something on top of it. And look, an additional income source is genuinely useful. But most people are already building diversified financial stability without recognizing it as such. Social Security contributions are accumulating. A 401k is compounding. Home equity is growing with every mortgage payment. A dual-income household is already a form of income diversification. These are not consolation prizes. They are real, compounding, parallel streams of stability. A dividend portfolio adds to that structure. It does not define it. Get the savings rate right, automate everything possible, use the tax-advantaged accounts available. The growth will follow. What it cannot do, though, is outrun a force that moves in the opposite direction just as quietly. And that force has a name, one that catches even the highest earners completely off guard. Nobody sits down one afternoon and decides to stop building wealth. It does not happen that way. It happens in increments. A slightly nicer apartment when the lease comes up. A car payment that is $120 higher than the last one because the salary went up, and it seemed reasonable at the time. A meal delivery habit that started at twice a week and became 4 times without anyone noticing. None of these feel like decisions. They feel like upgrades. And that is exactly what makes lifestyle creep the most effective wealth killer most people will ever encounter, because it never announces itself. Here is the mechanism that makes it genuinely dangerous. And this is the part that rarely gets explained. When income goes up, spending adjusts upward to match it. That part most people understand. What they underestimate is the asymmetry. Income can disappear overnight. A layoff, a health event that interrupts the ability to work. Income is more fragile than it feels during a good run, but the lifestyle that expanded to meet that income does not compress at the same speed. The new apartment lease runs another 16 months. The car payment does not renegotiate itself. The subscriptions keep drafting. The fixed costs that felt comfortable on a higher income become a structural problem on a lower one. And suddenly the gap between income and outflow, the gap where all wealth accumulation actually happens, has closed. Not because of a crisis, because of a series of reasonable feeling upgrades made during a period when everything was going well. That asymmetry is the trap, not the spending itself. Consider 2 people currently living in the same mid-sized American city, working in the same general industry. The first is a marketing director named Claire, earning $206,000 a year. Over the last 8 years, every raise Claire received translated into a visible upgrade in her life. Better apartment, newer car, more travel, a wardrobe that kept pace with her title. Her savings rate has hovered around 8% for most of that period because her expenses grew in lockstep with her income. On paper, she earns exceptionally well. In practice, she is roughly 6 weeks away from a serious problem if the income stops. Not because she made reckless decisions, because she made a long series of individually reasonable ones that collectively closed the gap. The second person is a supply chain analyst named Terrence, earning $91,000 a year. Terrence has received 4 meaningful raises over the same 8 years. Each time, he automated a portion of the increase directly into his investment accounts before the lifestyle had any opportunity to absorb it. His rent is the same as it was 3 years ago. His car is paid off. His savings rate is currently sitting at 22%. Terrence does not feel deprived. He has simply never let his baseline adjust upward to consume what his future self was going to need. Quietly, without drama, Terrence is building something that will outlast the salary that funded it. Same economy, same general time frame, completely different outcome, because one person maintained the gap between income and lifestyle, and one person let it close one upgrade at a time. The practical response to this is straightforward, and it only requires one rule applied consistently. Every time income increases, automate a meaningful portion of that increase into investments immediately, before it touches the checking account, before the lifestyle recalibrates. before it starts to feel like available money. The key word is before. Once the money lands in the account and sits there for a few weeks, the brain begins to treat it as normal. It gets absorbed, the window closes. But if the automation is set up the same week the raise takes effect, the baseline never adjusts upward to include it. The upgrade never feels like a sacrifice because the expectation was never built in the first place. Protect the gap. Every year, every raise, without exception. Because here is what the gap actually buys. And this is the part the spreadsheets never quite capture. It is not a larger number at retirement. It is not a better benchmark comparison. What the gap buys over enough time and with enough discipline applied to protecting it is the one thing that no salary increase can manufacture on its own. And that is what the final section is entirely about. Ask someone what they are actually working toward, and most will say some version of the same thing. Security, options, not having to worry. And those answers are not wrong, but they are incomplete, because security, options, and not worrying are not end states. They are descriptions of how time feels when it is yours, when you control how it gets spent, when nobody else's urgency gets to override your own priorities, simply because you cannot afford to say no. That is what the accumulation is actually for, not the number, the time. This is the shift that tends to happen somewhere in the late 30s for people who have been building the right structure. Money stops feeling like a scoreboard and starts functioning like a tool. A very specific kind of tool, one that converts financial margin into personal autonomy. And the difference between people who experience that shift and people who do not is rarely the size of their portfolio. It is whether the portfolio was built on a structure that generates options or built on a structure that just generates a larger number attached to the same constraints. Here's what buying back time actually looks like in practice. It is not a yacht. It is not a watch that costs more than a car. It looks like a Thursday afternoon project request landing in your inbox, one that would consume the next 2 weekends, and having the financial footing to decline it without anxiety. It looks like hiring someone to handle a task that costs you 3 hours every week, because 3 hours every week over a year is 156 hours. And that math starts to look very different when you attach it to something you would rather be doing. It looks like scheduling a medical appointment proactively instead of deferring it because the cost feels poorly timed, and catching something early that would have become significantly more expensive, in every sense, if left alone. Consider someone like Sandra, a mid-level finance manager in her early 40s, who spent her 30s building exactly the kind of structure this video has been describing. Solid savings rate, housing costs well within range, defense layer in place, lifestyle gap protected through several raises. By 41, Sandra had accumulated enough in liquid and semi-liquid assets that her monthly fixed costs were covered by a combination of passive income and a part-time consulting arrangement she chose, not one she needed. She did not retire. She did not move to a beach. What she did was spend the following Tuesday morning having coffee with her mother, who lives 15 minutes away, because her schedule now had room for a Tuesday morning. That afternoon, she left work at 3:30 to watch her son's soccer practice. Not the game, the practice. The ordinary one that most parents miss because it falls on a Wednesday at 4, and the calendar does not bend. That is not a dramatic story. It is a quiet one. And quiet is the point. There is another dimension to this that does not get discussed often enough. Financial margin creates the ability to show up for aging parents in practical, meaningful ways, whether that means helping fund an accessible living situation closer to home, or simply having the scheduling flexibility to be present during a difficult medical season. These are acts of care that require not just intention, but capacity. The capacity comes from the structure, and the structure has to be built before the need arrives, because by the time the need arrives, it is usually too late to build it. Close the loop on where this video started. The person lying awake at night, running numbers in their head, wondering if they were actually on track. They were not anxious about a net worth figure. They were anxious about whether the life they were working toward was genuinely being constructed, or whether the effort was accumulating without a destination. The answer to that anxiety is not a higher balance. It is a structure that runs cleanly in the background, absorbs pressure without collapsing, and gradually converts years of disciplined decisions into days that feel like yours. The defense, the savings rate, the automation, the protected gap. These are not financial concepts. They are the architects of a life that has options. And once that architecture is understood, Once the full picture of what resilient wealth requires is clear, there is one final thing worth stepping back to consider. Not a new tactic, not another optimization, just a clear-eyed summary of what all of this actually means and what to watch for next. Here is the central realization this video has been building toward. Resilient wealth is not a number you hit. It is a structure you build, one that holds when life does not cooperate, absorbs pressure without collapsing, and quietly converts years of right decisions into days that feel like yours. A few things worth carrying forward. The gap between your income and your lifestyle is where wealth is actually built, not the size of the income itself. A high net worth without the right systems underneath it is a fragile snapshot, not a foundation. Automation removes the most dangerous variable in any long-term financial plan, which is the human decision made in a weak moment. Defense comes before offense. A structure that cannot survive a crisis is not a structure. It is a bet. And time is the thing the money is ultimately buying. The accumulation only matters if it eventually translates into how the days are actually spent. Watch for the moments when the gap wants to close. A raise, a new fixed expense, an upgrade that feels reasonable in isolation. Each one is a quiet decision about whether the structure gets stronger or softer. One question worth sitting with going forward. Everything covered here assumes the underlying system, the interest rates, the tax rules, the cost of staying in place, remains roughly stable. But what happens when those assumptions shift quietly underneath you, faster than the plan accounts for? That is worth understanding. And that is exactly what comes next. If this reframes how you think about where you are headed, share it with someone who is quietly running the same numbers at night. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on how these systems actually work. The conversation continues.